All right, welcome everybody. My name is Steve McDonald and I'm one of the founders of Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, an Australian non-profit organisation that has been attempting to get clinical trials established with MDMA in particular over the last 3 years. It's my pleasure to be facilitating this panel. I have joining me here Dr. Andrew Katelaris, who is a former licensed grower and an activist. Dr. David Bearman, from the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine in California. Next to him, Dr. Alex Wodak from the Australian Drug Law Reform Foundation. And Mark Rayner, activist, provider, and a member of the Hemp Party. And on the opposite end there, we have Andrew Kavasilas, who is a hemp grower and also a member of the Hemp Party. So welcome, panel. It's lovely to be here with you. And so we're continuing the conversation, and particularly in this panel, we're focusing on medical cannabis trials and are they reinventing the wheel? And of course, the answer to that question has a lot of implications for the speed of availability of cannabis within Australia. So I might start by asking perhaps one of the doctors to give us a brief rundown of the avenues that are available for the introduction of new medicines in Australia. And one of them is clinical trials, but it's not the only one, I understand. Would anybody like to jump on that question? Yeah? Is that a... Yeah, yeah.
All right, so the question basically was how can you get cannabis in Australia, right?
How can it be accepted as a legal prescribable medicine?
Yeah, but no, that's a loaded question, and I won't answer that question because I have very little interest in whether it's a prescribed medicine. Mm-hmm. Just to make my position fairly clear, when we talk about doctors being the gatekeepers for medical cannabis, we've got to look at a profession that's basically not an independent profession anymore. The influence of the pharmaceutical company on their thinking and their behaviour is overwhelming. Their behaviour in things like antibiotics, they've created by profligate use of antibiotics, they've created an epidemic of disease-resistant bacteria, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. These people aren't the best to hold it. At the moment, a single parent with a grow tent and clones that we've provided is a better neurologist than a professor of neurology, right? I mean, the people that we're dealing with... No, seriously, right? I'm sick of coming to these things and hearing hot air from people that don't actually know what they're talking about, right? The only people that are really should be spoken to and listened to, firstly, are the patients, if they're able to, and if they're not able to, they're carers, right? The people we directly work with now are the carers of patients with intractable epilepsy, right? In 12 months since we got access to high CBD cannabis varieties and started to clone them up, we've treated successfully more patients than every practitioner in this country combined, right? And we've caused less side effects. So talk about TGA. The TGA are basically a criminal organisation that are owned by Big Pharma, right? Most of the drugs that come on here are poorly tested. Yes, there's a mountain of statistics, but what comes out? Why are the drugs needing to be replaced all the time? Why do the side effects follow 10 years after clinical use? This is what they're doing. It's just basically a scam machine. They've destroyed the food supply, made the people sick, and then charge them big money for drugs that don't properly fix their problems. These aren't people that I choose to deal with. Now, to come back to your question, there has to, in my mind, there has to be a 3-tier level of supply. This can only work with cannabis. I take Alex's comment on board that people don't go and grow their poppies, because growing poppies and extracting opium is difficult. Growing cannabis and extracting cannabinoids is very easy, right? And there's a very clear suggestion. There's more to the plant than its pharmacology. And that's what people with narrow minds can't understand. There is a dimensional issue. If people want to be involved at the herbal level, herbal cannabis is a starting point from my law, and my campaign will go on until herbal cannabis is unrestricted, right? It was brought in an illegal activity, and stepwise or incremental changes just won't do it, right? With the group of patients I'm working with, the intractable epileptics, they have a 15% death rate per year, cumulative. So in 7 years, most of them are dead. We don't think waiting 2 years is an ethical behaviour if hundreds of kids are going to die, right? So the first thing is the removal, if I had my way, the removal of criminal interdiction. Just do the Dutch model. Instruct the police not to interfere with cannabis less than 20 plants per person. Just walk away from it. You don't have to stir up the shock jocks and say, oh, look, we're going soft on drugs. Just back away from it. But from a practical point of view, because we do want to do science as well, and I'm definitely not anti-science, but in something like epilepsy or appetite stimulation or muscle spasm, the common indications, the science is done by the patients themselves. Real science is only done at the bedside, right? It's not done with lab rats and things like that. It's done at the bedside when you're doing clinical medicine.
Andrew, thank you. David, speak about the American experience, please.
Yeah, even though I'm not Australian, I have an opinion on this. And my opinion is that Australians are pretty much like Europeans. They're pretty much like Americans. And we have had 20,000 research studies. A lot of them were on mice, but GW Pharmaceuticals has been doing research on tincture cannabis, which is a whole plant alcohol extract, since 1999. We have THC that's been on the market in the States since 1985. I'm just one practitioner. I have 2,500 or so patients who benefit from medicinal cannabis. So and I forgot the 5,000 years of history. So do we really have to reinvent the wheel? Unless we think that the Australian populace is as different from everybody else as kangaroos are from other animals, then you can rely on the research that's already been done. And I couldn't agree more with what has already been said, that when you de-demonize the drug and make it normal, and the problem is not the drug, the problem is the laws. And having these laws that interfere with research is obscene. I mean, there is incredible research with animals and some amazing anecdotes.
Thank you.
I guess that came from the pro-cancer sect here. But anyway, there's some amazing anecdotes of people who said, no, I'm not going to take that poison. I'm not going to use chemotherapy. I'm just going to take marijuana. Now, as a physician, I wouldn't recommend that, but they were cured, or there's no evidence that they have cancer. So I really think that in making your arguments, in making your plea, the point that's been said repeatedly here, we have more than enough information. There's nothing wrong with doing additional studies, but what the hell is the government waiting for? More people to die, more people to suffer? So I would, point out that we've got plenty of research out there, and that there are a number of indications for which it's clear that cannabis is useful. I think the next thing that we really need to do research on is to take a look at other cannabinoids in addition to THC and CBD, and take a look at what role the various terpenes play. That's where the research really ought to go.
Thank you, David. It's very easy sitting in a room of advocates to talk ourselves up and believe ourselves. But the fact is that we're facing political opinion here in Australia that says medical trials are needed, and a number of state premiers have come out and said that, despite the fact that our Prime Minister's on record as saying that cannabis trials aren't needed. But one of the things we need to consider is that this is, as history has shown, it's not really about the science, it's about social opinion and politics in terms of getting laws changed. And in order to get the laws changed, we need to understand what we're facing, from the other side of the argument. And I think Dr. Alex Wodak is able to give us a good indication of that. Alex.
Okay. Look, you asked the question. I'm not sure that it's been answered yet. How does the system actually operate in Australia?
Please.
Yeah, and it's quite simple. It's also quite complicated. But the simple part of it is that the manufacturer or the agent of a candidate drug has to apply to the regulatory body, the Therapeutic Goods Administration. And the fee that is charged, which was mentioned in the previous section, easily often over $200,000, is in fact a user pay system. And that was introduced about 2 decades ago. And the system works much better now with the user pay system than it did before. And the user pay system is an estimate of the cost to the TGA of processing that application. And they have some kind of formula for working out what that's going to cost, and then the fee is charged to the commercial agent. One of the defects of this system is that, unfortunately, is that drugs that are thought to be effective but are not going to make a lot of money, it's very difficult for the agent to pay that fee. And we have a number of drugs in Australia where that applies. That fee can be waived. The government has that in the legislation, that they can waive the fee if necessary. And then there's a complicated processing system where there's a very detailed framework, and the applicants have to provide the molecular structure of the drug and animal testing and safety testing in humans, and then evidence that it's effective. And then there's another system as well which touches on this to some extent, which is the pharmaceutical benefits system. And Australia was an international leader in setting this up about 60 years ago, and we hear a lot about this in the papers, and that system is very advanced in Australia and has been copied by many other countries. Health departments in many other countries have set up a similar system, and that decides which drugs will be subsidized by the taxpayer. In other words, the question that is asked of a committee, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, is which drugs is it worthwhile to the taxpayer to subsidize? And obviously if a drug is going to control a transmissible infection which could endanger the lives of many people, then that might prompt the committee to fund it. And now that in an advancement about 10 years ago, that committee spawned a subcommittee which looks at specifically at the economics in a very sophisticated way. And that committee, PBAC, Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, doesn't report to the health minister, it reports to federal cabinet. It's a very high level committee. And so overall, it's a complicated system, not perfect, but it works.
Is that it has any relation to the approval of new medicines, though, does it, the benefit scheme, or not? Yeah, go on, yeah.
I don't want to be argumentative, Alex, but you say the system works. The system delivered Valium back then. It went through all the TGA testing. They said it was a non-addictive substitute for barbiturates. And now we've got about 10% of the Australian population dependent on it. The system doesn't work. The system is a grossly manipulated con job, sort of glossed over by... Thanks.
You know, part of the conundrum here is, what is cannabis? Yes, it's a medicine, but it's also a vegetable. It's been called a nutraceutical, and it's been called an herb. And the regulatory agencies have a hard time getting their minds around this, because we've become enamored with manufactured pharmaceuticals, which are almost always single molecule. And a plant, coffee has 880 molecules, tomato 380, and cannabis 483. So they say, well, this is just too complicated to understand, we'll just forget about it. That obviously, you know, we don't forget about it when it's a tomato. Why should we forget about it when it's cannabis? And the other thing is, if you go back 50 or 60 years, you find that medicinal cannabis was legal in the United States. And in Australia, in the 1920s, you had a cigarette called Canadana, which was advertised for treatment of asthma. So it's not like this is something new. I mean, I understand what Dr. Womack is saying, that there is a procedure, and it seems to me that you need to proceed on all fronts. You can't ignore the established route, but the established route, I think the problem is that it was set up more for single molecule compounds than it was for vegetables.
Thank you, David. Andrew, down the end there, would you like to comment?
Well, in terms of where we are and trying to reinvent the wheel, it's still pretty hard to get cannabis to fit in the pigeonhole, or to meet the regulations that they have sort of set up. And like Dr. Wodak is reiterating, yes, it's a users pay situation for people who want to have something approved through the TGA. Cannabis can't even really get to that level either, because in the scheduling, it's a Schedule 9 plant. It's basically the capture all on all the cannabinoids, although there is some rescheduling being done. But even to be able to say that you want to do some research with cannabis, the thing is where you're going to get it, where you're going to get a lawful supply, and then under our scheduling, it's Schedule 9, you can't do any research on it. And so there's another committee that you have to get things through, the rescheduling committee. Who pays for that, how much it costs, I don't know. But another thing that was very interesting for me when we talk about these companies and the kind of support given to these companies. We've had medical cannabis inquiries, a few now. We've never seen any of the big companies that do access and do use a TGA, that have got products of pain drugs and other things. We've never seen any of those people, any of those companies attend them and give any evidence, or, as far as I know, make any public submissions to those. And so we have representatives for them and who fight very strenuously. They're medical professionals. They're the head of the Pharmacy Guild, head of the Royal, Physicians, and who get up there and talk about the need for cannabis to meet these stringent regulations set by the TGA, because all these other companies are doing it. Now, these other companies, and it's probably just to add on from what Andrew is saying, if we have a look at them, a lot of them, I don't know how their companies' setups are or their business and their shareholders, but you've got companies who have been just fined billions of dollars over the years for criminal actions against the people, making false claims, false research, overpricing for drugs, willingly and convicted criminally. One of the big ones, GlaxoSmithKline, who own half of the opium produced in Australia, was fined for never adding vitamin C to its Ribena drink, a common drink that was used for so long, for so many people, paid extra for. You bought it from the chemist. And it just adds to what Andrew's saying, and probably points the finger at those in the medical profession who will get up and speak at those inquiries, in a way supporting those companies, criminal companies, who repeatedly have acted in criminal ways, have been fined for it, and saying that this system is good and we should make cannabis fit into that. And then blurring the lines between recreational use of cannabis and medical use of cannabis, enough so that it does blur the lines, it does create, question marks. Yeah. So, there's a lot more to it. And I touched on earlier, when we talk about medical cannabis and going to see your doctor to talk about medical cannabis, the doctor is bound by not so much his Hippocratic oath anymore, but by the insurance company. If that doctor prescribes a product or recommends a product for a patient and something happens, if that product hasn't, met all those TGA requirements and hasn't got approval, that doctor is at risk. His insurance is null and void, and if anything does happen to that patient, that doctor is liable. And so you won't find the medical profession wholeheartedly or in any way sometimes looking at medical cannabis, because they can't. They really can't. And a doctor earning $500,000 or $250,000 a year isn't really going to worry about medical cannabis, and nor are they going to worry too much about when you present with a particular set of conditions, symptoms that all right, we'll give them some antibiotics. That doctor's covered. Whether those antibiotics worked or not for you is not is not his problem. He's covered. He did everything right, and he's covered.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just where we haven't heard from Mark yet. Mark, please.
Well, there's not really much I can add to all of that. Basically, cannabis is a square peg for a round hole, you know. All these complicated things, it doesn't fit the algorithm, you know. They overcomplicate things, and it's a very simple thing to do, you know. So, taking it to the next level, reinventing the wheel is not really a... Yeah, well, you know, I get a lot of people come through my door and they're you know, on their last legs. It's something they run to when nothing else works, you know. And the over-regulation and all that sort of stuff, just, it's killing people. It's taking them to, not taking them, but taking them out, basically. The over-regulation of everything is killing people. It's got to stop. You know, there's, like Alex was saying, they've got all these complicated measures and tests and this and that and the other thing, and cannabis just doesn't fit into that little perfect round hole that they've created for themselves. So we have to change that hole. Bring it up, change the law, yeah, take it on. Everyone stand up. Reinventing the wheel is not really necessary, I think. So.
No, and I must say, from our work at prison, what I've learned is that the clinical trial system is a very slow system. You know, it can take between 5 and sometimes up to 20 years to get a new medicine approved once the various phases of trials are completed. As an example, in the USA, the medical trials with MDMA or ecstasy started in, I think, 2000, and they were approved in 2000. I think the first trial started in 2003. They're estimating that MDMA will be a prescribable medicine in the USA in 2021. So that's an example of how quickly the system doesn't work.
I'd like to mention something about getting public opinion behind this. And one of the things that people seem to want to do is lower the cost of government. A good friend of mine was the director of the Illinois State Department of Mental Health. He wrote a book called Cannabinomics because he reckoned that if we introduce cannabis into the medical system, that it would decrease the cost of providing mental health services. And I think that that is certainly true. An example of that is there was a residential care facility in Israel. And a documentary was done by Zach Klein, excellent. And what they found is that people slept better, they ate better, they were less depressed, they gained weight, and their use of prescription medications dropped by 20%. And I think we're going to see something that may be really helpful in the near future. There's an organization in the States called the American Association of Retired People, ARP, and it's fairly powerful, probably more powerful than they should be. About 10 years ago, they were going to write an article about the use of cannabis for health problems for the elderly, and it was too controversial and it was killed. And I got a call or an email about a month ago, and they're going to do it again. And I think when you have a major publication that is outreaching to the over 50 population, that is a big sea change. And my suggestion would be to show that to the politicians. Because on the one hand, you have what Alex said about the formal system, but I've been a bureaucrat maybe half of my professional life, and the system can be interpreted any way you want. And if you want to make it difficult, as you've seen, you can. And if you want to make it easy, you can do that. And one way to make it easier is to get the people who vote, who the politicians listen to realize that this is something that is helpful for them. Oh, one last thing. I want to take a minute to tell you my book is going to be for sale. in the back of the room, when we're done, my son will be there. I'll be answering questions.
Thanks,
And
David.
if anybody wants to sell anything else, bring it back there.
Thank you very much. I think we were meant to be discussing the 3 trials. So if you like, I could summarize very briefly where we are.
Please, that would be great.
Okay, so the New South Wales government advertised or called for expressions of interest on 3 trials and allocated $9 million to these 3 trials. One is going to be on childhood epilepsy. A second one is going to be on people who have intractable nausea and vomiting following cancer chemotherapy and haven't responded to conventional treatments. And the third one is on loss of appetite and advanced wasting in people with severe forms of cancer. I'm involved in the third of those 3 trials with a group of 10 or 12 other people, and as far as we understand that no one else is going to lodge an expression of interest for that third trial. So we are reasonably confident that we might get that. There's quite a stiff time frame imposed on all this. I think we have to have the expressions of interest finalised and lodged by the end of this month, May. It's very soon, I know that. And the trials themselves have to be completed within 3 years from Wodak, which is pretty short, believe it or not. And I was not a fan. No, the other thing that's very relevant is that since New South Wales went into these trials, the Queensland and the Victorian governments have indicated a desire to also be involved in the New South Wales trials. So they'll extend across 3 jurisdictions. The details of that, as far as I know, are being worked out. I didn't advocate setting up the trials. I'm not crazy about them, but the trials are going to happen, and we may as well make the best use of them. Having said all that, I must say I've been impressed by what's happened with the trials, in the sense that people are working together who didn't work together before. We've got some very experienced, accomplished researchers with a lot of knowledge about cannabis research who are involved in these trials. And I think one of the things that we will get out of this that I hadn't really appreciated before is that we're going to have a network of people across the country who know a hell of a lot about recent research in medicinal cannabis and evidence about its effectiveness and side effects and all that. Credible people who will be champions for this area. And I think that's going to be a huge benefit to us, not just for the next 3 years, but in the years to come after that. So I think that these trials, whilst I didn't welcome them initially and wanted to see what needs to happen and happen quickly, I think the researchers having this research arm is actually going to be very helpful for us. So I think the timetable has been set out and expressions of interest to be lodged, and then the government is going to make a quick decision and the trials will start soon after that. So I think it's actually looking much more encouraging than I thought it was initially.
Thanks, Alex.
A few things to say about that, but firstly, just a couple of points about what trials are. Everyone talks about trials as though they know what they're talking about. They don't. There's a number of different types of trials. When you're introducing a new therapeutic substance, the first one you do is you give a quantity of it to well volunteers for safety. Now, on this weekend alone, we could have satisfied all those safety criteria, I think, many times over. So safety's not an issue. And that really touches on what Andrew said, that I've provided or facilitated provision to thousands of people now over the years without a care for potential toxicity, because I know the cannabinoids are the safest therapeutic substances known, right? There's no doubt about that. By any criteria, it's even safer than water, right? I mean, that's the way it is. It's just non-toxic substance, and there's very few in the pharmacology. That's the safety side of it. The next thing you should do is a simple pilot study looking for signs of activity, right? That means you just treat any of the volunteers that come. especially those with intractable conditions. Now, it's fine that $9 million is being squandered on academics, and 3 years go before we even get a chance to start treating the thousands of people that need it. In those 3 years, right, something like 40% of the epileptic children that are now alive will be dead, right? This isn't a luxury. This isn't an academic exercise. The people we see day to day and the other carers see day to day will die without the medicine, right? It's an obscenity the way they've done this. What we're currently doing is a pilot study. I'll just take a moment to explain why this double-blind, placebo-controlled method is not the right way to address at least the epilepsy problem, and I'll tell you why. What we find, firstly, there's a wide range of responses across the different people. So we start them off in a small dose and titrate upwards, but the final dose that we use appears to have very little relationship to either body mass or body surface area, so they're the usual way that they decide what a drug dose is. So if some professor on a big salary getting public money is going to do a trial, they'll give everyone based on milligrams per kilo, and that will dramatically exhibit how it will work, because there's a grade you have to titrate for dose. The other thing is, one drug doesn't work for everyone, so we start them off in a certain way. We'll start them off on some unheated CBDA, and then we'll go to CBD if that hasn't responded. Then we'll go through the THCs and the CBNs. So we run through a program and find the best response for that individual. If you do a double-blinded placebo control study, you don't do that. And so the drug appears to be less effective. The only reason placebo-controlled trials are done at all and why they're designed is for two competing drug companies to put a drug of very similar action against each other and see if they can get the magic 20% different response that makes them claim it's a successful drug. Now, bear that in mind. Some of these epileptic drugs only demonstrate 20% improvement over placebo, right? That's nothing for a kid that's having 60 seizures a day, because if you knock off that down to 40, they're just as sick. But they're selling these drugs sometimes at $12,000 a year for stiripentol. They're selling it at an outlandish price, claiming that it's been properly tested. Yeah, it has been properly tested and shown to be 20% better than nothing, which is almost nothing, right? What we need here for people with life-threatening disorders, you've got to treat them like decent, threatened human beings. They're not guinea pigs, right? With that 9 million that half-wit bed is squandering, we could treat every epileptic child in this country in 12 months. We could get grow tents and clones happening, right? It is an obscenity, right? 3 years is an obscenity for the people that I see day to day.
Can I just on those trials, I might just say I'm a licensed hemp grower and I've been involved with Andrew with growing high THC before. Look, in October last year, I was asked by the New South Wales government to join a consortium to produce a product that may or may not be used in these clinical trials. We looked at that. Within about 2 weeks, we were told that no, that wasn't going to happen because no one was going to get a permit. The expressions of interest came out, and we were encouraged to put in expressions of interest. In the formulating of that, I got in contact with various universities and other research bodies that could help. As far as we were concerned, we would be harvesting otherwise discarded cannabinoids. So we had pretty good interest from unis and especially up in Queensland there. But in that, yes, I spoke to health department officials who were involved in the coordination of those EOIs, and I mean it's quite technical, and I'm not the full technical bit on it, but it's sort of carry on from what Andrew was saying that well, for a start, I was told of the $9 million, $6 million was already taken up by the academics, and basically we were told straight out that 2 of those clinical trials were probably never going to get up, and no one in Australia was going to be allowed to grow cannabis to do those things to get a medical product ready for clinical trial purposes. So, but the heartening bit of that was that all effort would be put into importing Epidiolex from the UK, from GW Pharmaceuticals, to at least put all the effort into doing the paediatrics epileptic trials. So, look, in the end, health officials were kind of good about it, and were basically asked to continue and go through the motions of put our expressions in. I've found that this could be a long way into nowhere. I find that Premier Baird and the other premiers who have made announcements are all being quite hollow. It's a way to shut sick people up and get them off their back, where they can say, well, look, we're entering into this. They're having a go. I firmly believe that medical, and this is coming from the Hemp Party. I'm actually the secretary of the Hemp Party, and what we're pushing for is for the Minister for Health, Susan Ley, and the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, to step up on this. It's a Commonwealth. It's a federal issue, and when we look at the TGA and how its impact on the whole medical profession in all the states, that's where we need to push. We need Tony Abbott and the Minister for Health to look into this. And we need an inquiry. We need a full federal inquiry into the rescheduling of cannabinoids to allow for proper research to be done by not just one or two groups, but for various groups. If there's going to be any bending of rules or writing of new legislation, it should be around how to get more research, proper research done. That's what's really going on. There is lots of announcements being made by Victoria, Queensland, but it's all hollow. I really just don't believe them. We really need Commonwealth stepping in on that. And we just got to remember as well, Tony Abbott was the Minister for Health in the Howard government when Bob Carr was talking about this here in New South Wales. So this has passed his desk before. It's not new for him.
Andrew.
And the more that they can, get sick people off their back and say there's something happening, the more clean air they get. We have to, really keep the pressure on.
Andrew,
everyone.
thanks for that. I think we haven't got much time left, and I want to open it up to questions very shortly. But what I would like to ask the panel, just before we open up to questions, is all right, very quickly.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just want to touch on what Andrew had to say. It's a square peg in the round hole thing. Cannabis therapy, I found, is very, very individual. You can't just give everyone the same thing, right? What works for one, Michelle Whitelaw is a good example, and all the CLK5 kids. Not what's working for one is not working for another. So, you have to chop and change, you have to adjust things as you're going through, and trials are just going to fail because of this simple fact, What Andrew said, you've got to play with things. You've got to, what doesn't work for one, what will work for another, and we've got to adjust things and move along. And from the ground floor level, trials are just frustrating,
Thanks, Mark.
That's it.
So just following on from what Andrew said there, I'm given that there is this momentum now for clinical trials and money's even been allocated. How do we change that? How do we shift that momentum? How do we find strategies that can allow us to get around doing those trials?
I want to comment on the trials. Obviously, they're going for the low-hanging fruit. I mean, in terms of nausea, in terms of appetite stimulation, those studies were done in 8 states in the United States 30 years ago. In terms of seizure disorder, that was done in 1947. Australia, with their clinical trials, has the opportunity to get on the cutting edge. We need to have clinical trials on attention deficit disorder. We need to have clinical trials on post-traumatic stress disorder. And most importantly, we need to have clinical trials on cancer. And this is an opportunity for Australia to lead the world.
Thank you.
Wishful thinking, mate. We don't do that here.
I think we do. We just do it illegally.
Listen, what I find really disturbing with Australia about leading the world, in many ways, some decades ago, Australia was a leader of the world, right? We pioneered a lot of social policies. We're just in the grip of right-wing scum at the moment. Now, coming back to these trials, no, we are. You can't deny it, right? Listen, we've got Fukushima melting down on our borders, and they're talking about expanding the uranium industry. These aren't normal people. These aren't people that have got a life-affirming approach to existence, right? We're in real trouble. That's the way I see it. Now, talk about the trials. Apart from the hideous squandering of rare funds, I'm not against them having trials. They can do what they want, but so can I, right? And my trial is to set up grow tents in patients' houses, give them high-quality, organically extracted material, and then we report on that, right? I'll tell you what, we've done our trials. The results are amazing. No, they're amazing, right? Not in everyone. About half the epileptic kids respond dramatically. And remember, it's not only seizure control, because the nasty sedative drugs can get seizure control sometimes. It's intelligence enhancing, right? That's where it gets really satisfying, when you can turn around someone's life and not only cure their disease, but actually launch them back into life. And it's very, very satisfying. So we need 3 levels of supply, right? The ultimate human right is to be able to grow a plant, especially the best plant in the universe, right? So home growing is a necessity, right? Whether you go through a medical phase and get 10 plants because you've got this condition that your nice doctor said you had or something like that, that's one thing. The next thing, we do need an element of science in this that you won't get from Big Pharma. Big Pharma will try and chemically alter the cannabinoids so they can patent them. What we need is an intermediate between home growing and Big Pharma, and that would be the co-op model, where you either take on proxy growers, so someone like Cav or me or any of them here would take on 100 or 1,000 patients, and therefore you have the right to grow 1,000 or 10,000 plants and extract them and look after them. And part of that obligation is then you provide statistics, right? That is the best way. That's an organic method that doesn't involve the TGA and that doesn't involve excess delays or having your pot in dicky little containers from GW flown over from England. You know, it is a backyard first, it is a small-scale company second, and if GW or anyone else wants pharmaceutical-grade single extract, they can have it, but I won't be taking it.
Thank you. Your question?
Okay. We have a serious issue in the media right now. There's a 2-year-old child that her fearless father treated her with medicinal cannabis, and she went from bedridden to saying she wanted to play outside and, Daddy, my tummy's not sore. So her father was charged with giving this child medicinal cannabis, and I don't think this is a heart-centered space to take a child. You know, his visitation rights were severely limited because of this, so that in fact, that issue in itself is inhumane, and you know, that's just... So basically my question to Dr. Andrew Katelaris is why is it important that this 2-year-old who's just on her 6th dose of chemotherapy, why does this child and all the other children with cancer and epilepsy need medicinal cannabis, and how can this help them, Andrew?
Well, that's a heartbreaking story, but more heartbreaking is the fact that it could be repeated thousands of times around the country. Now, I might have sounded a bit hot-headed before, but we've basically got a medical system that's quite prepared to sacrifice the lives and the well-being of children and adults for their own political ideology and financial gain, right? As far as I'm concerned, we're led by sociopaths. There is no other definition for it, right? They push junk food on the kids get sick, and then you can't have life-saving medicine, right? You can have 6 cycles of chemotherapy that might cost $100,000, and even if you survive it, a lot of the people we're seeing now are chemo so-called survivors, but they're having seizures, they're growth retarded, they're learning disabled, right? It's a disaster out there, and I don't exaggerate. We're in the hands of sociopaths, and this is just a very clear example of how that applies.
Another question? Yeah.
I'm wondering who's going to supervise these trials, and is there any chance of the proper research being done within a 3-year period? And thirdly, what's going to become of the medicinal cannabis patients until that time, until those trials are finished and published?
Can I just say that the guy asking the question here, that's Dr. Graham Irvine. He has a PhD in the legalisation of medical cannabis in New South Wales. He's done a lot of work, a lot of research, looked at a lot of the recognised medical cannabis trials that have been done around the world, and for me culminated in being the first individual to bring Sativex in from the UK to assist with his Parkinson's. But he's a hell of a researcher and he knows what he's talking about. Yeah, thanks, Graham.
The trials are rapidly moving in terms of the decisions that are being made and where so I don't know, I don't have a clear idea of what our bid is going to involve, even though it's only a month away. We've considered a lot of questions, been very useful discussions, and one of the things that each of the trials have is the trials do have a compassionate arm, so that there is a capacity within each of the trials, I understand, to provide beyond the guidelines, the narrow guidelines of the trial, to potential subjects who don't quite fit the criteria. All trials have a quandary that they have to deal with, which is that the more restricted they make the criteria, the greater the confidence that people have in the findings of the trial, but the less generalisable the trial is to other people with similar conditions. And generally what happens is that people start off doing trials that are very, very restricted without much generalisability, and then as the trials are repeated in that condition, the subsequent trials get much less restrictive and therefore more generalisable. David is right. There have been trials that have been done in this area that I'm working in, my group is working in. Those trials have been reviewed, not by me, but by others, and we are trying to build on some of the deficiencies in the previous work that's been done. All trials have deficiencies. There's no such thing as a perfect trial. And I haven't read those previous trials, but it does seem as though they have significant deficiencies in them. And I'm not sorry that this trial is going ahead. I think it'll actually be very useful.
Thanks, Alex. Another question?
Yeah, just a couple of questions. I'm wondering who is actually going to be growing this cannabis for the tests. That seems to be very unclear. Is it going to come from Australia or Australian growers? And it seems to me that Andrew Katelaris and quite a few other people have already done a hell of a lot of testing on this this medicine, food medicine. Why can't that be put into the trial data that's starting from the government instead of reinventing the wheel?
I'm not certain about this, but I think they're trying to punish the people that had the temerity to go ahead without and not actually invite them onto the trials, right? But who cares? They'll get better medicine herbally, right? I mean, that's my take-home message. Firstly, it's a herbal medicine, right? If you want it as a technical medicine, you can have it, but you can't stop the people having a herbal medicine.
You know, there are a variety of ways of proving that something is medically useful. We've become enamored with research-based medicine, but I know a few years ago I heard a talk, and only about 35% of what American doctors do is supported by double-blind studies. Much of what we do in medicine is a result of historical trial and error. And there are such things as having a case study, and it could be a case study of one. And that's what's being discussed here is, yes, you can have double-blind studies, but why not have case studies as well? And when you're talking about cancer, the way to do a double-blind is not say, well, we're going to give this person marijuana and this person nothing. What we're going to do is we're going to take people who are getting conventional chemotherapy and give them marijuana, or people who say, I don't want conventional chemotherapy and take it, and pair them up sort of epidemiologically with people of similar age, sex, and geographic location who don't want to take marijuana. So you don't have to arbitrarily say, we're going to give you this medicine that we're pretty sure will cure you, and you don't get it. No, we leave that to the individual and the decisions that they're already making. I mean, once you start talking about doing trials, there's a great opportunity to incorporate what people are already doing and to recognize what people are already doing. And it's not an either-or situation. The university-based double-blind clinical trial studies are fine, but so too are case studies and so too are epidemiological studies. And hopefully in this discussion about studies that it will be with the point in mind of improving the quality of life of people who have a whole host of illnesses and not just stopping at the low-hanging fruit.
The gold standard in medical research is called the randomized controlled trial. Many of you will have heard of these before, and the idea is that people who fit certain criteria are randomly allocated to an experimental group that receives the experimental intervention, and then the rest get the control group gets the standardized conditions. And there's no doubt that's been a very useful way for helping medicine to advance a lot. The history of randomized control trials is that the first randomized control trial in the world was conducted by the British Navy in the time of Captain Cook, looking at the effect of citrus fruits on scurvy. And that result showed a very clear benefit to citrus fruits in reducing scurvy. It took 150 years for the British Navy to change their rules. Randomized control trials really took off after the Second World War and have really, if you're talking to ministers' advisors, they're the only kind of trials they'll pay any attention to. Rightly or wrongly, that's still the case today. Just in the last week or two, a very prestigious science journal called Nature published an article in support of what are called N=1 trials, which are an alternative, not randomized controlled trials, and running through the arguments about why N=1 trials really ought to be given much more emphasis. Well, I don't think this is the right occasion to go through the pros and cons of those different ways of doing trials, but I think in 10 or 20 years' time, the current emphasis and reliance on randomized controls isn't going to continue. There'll be much more attention to different kinds of trial designs. Leaving all that aside, it is important that we have types of medical research that we can rely on, that are very efficient in finding out and separating truth from falsehood.
Thanks, Alex. We do need to wrap up, I'm afraid. The march is about to start and we've got to hear some final words. I'd like to thank everybody for being here, and particularly the panel for their educated comments. Can you please put your hands together for the panel?
Yeah, the panel. I love a good panel.